Okay, hello everyone. This is the feedback to your practice question that you did for conflict and tension, paper 1 hour exam. Firstly, well done to you all. Some really good work that was done, so well done for that. This just gives you an overview of the exam questions and how you should tackle them, so just give this a little pause if you want to look at that in a bit more detail. So moving ahead to question 1. Question 1 said, study source A. Source A opposes Germany. How do you know? Explain your answer by using source A and your contextual knowledge. So you only need to spend 6 minutes on this question. The key thing with this source is that this figure represents Germany, and he looks as though he's being held down by these two police officers that really represent the Allies, so kind of represent Britain, France, etc. And he is saying to them, giving him rope. So the German criminal says to the Allied police, says, "Here, I say, stop, you're hurting me." And then he says as an aside, which means that he's not in earshot of these police officers. He's saying, if I only whine enough, I may be able to wriggle out of this yet. So what the source is basically saying is that Germany can't be trusted, that Germany is pretending to be crippled and restrained by the Treaty of Versailles. But in actual fact, it is just trying to get out of having a punishment that it deserves. So it opposes Germany. And you can see by the look on Germany's face that it looks a little bit shifty, a little bit untrustworthy. So that's basically what the source is saying. And obviously, the kind of with the Allies being portrayed as policemen, the inference there is that Germany is a criminal in this source. So that's some of the evidence for how we would know that the source opposes Germany. And obviously it's a cartoon published in Britain. Just be aware that it was written before the Treaty of Versailles was actually signed, so it's very much about the negotiations, and what's actually wrapped around Germany at this time is a rope which says armistice. Okay, so that's an example answer, so you can pause that, just have a look at that in a bit more detail. You don't really need to write about the provenance for this question, but you do need to write about the content, and you need to link it to your own knowledge. Okay, so maybe link it to the fact that some countries, like France, for example, thought the Treaty of Versailles was a little bit too lenient. So question number 2 is all about usefulness. So you have to look at a couple of sources. Now this one is a German newspaper cartoon entitled Clemenceau the Vampire. Now Clemenceau was the leader of France, and the figure on the bed represents Germany, and they're using the idea of a vampire. So the fact that Clemenceau is portrayed as a vampire, vampires generally sort of mythical monsters, aren't they? Generally have negative connotations. You've got the bats outside, for example, and that Germany is being portrayed almost like as a defenseless victim within this cartoon. This one is from a guy called John Maynard Keynes. He was an economist, so he's an expert on money. He actually resigned in protest at the Treaty of Versailles, so we know he's going to be against the Treaty of Versailles. So when you're writing about the usefulness of sources, you need to write about what's useful about the content of the source, but also what's useful about the provenance of the source, and then link all of that into your contextual knowledge. So there's quite a bit to do for this question. You would have 18 minutes in the exam to do this. Really, you've got 9 minutes per source. And my advice would be to write a paragraph on each of the two sources. You do not need an overall conclusion. Some of you wrote an overall conclusion, but you don't really need an overall conclusion to say which of the two is the most useful. You can kind of get that by judging in each paragraph how useful a source is. So I'll show you what I mean. This just gives you, by the way, a little bit of some explanation for this written source, so what some of the words mean, so you can pause that and have a look at that in your own time. So one of the things I taught you in class to do is to use this extentometer, so to think about how useful things are. Use words like extremely, highly, very, quite, partially, slightly, not at all. So you want to quantify how useful the sources are. And just remember that usefulness isn't the same as reliability. So an unreliable source can be extremely useful, and a source that's really reliable can actually be not that useful if it only gives you basic factual information, for example. It might not actually be that useful. So don't just assume that if a source is biased, it's not useful. It's a bit more complex than that. So there's an example for source B, so you can have a little look at that and read that. Some of the key points there is the content is really useful for showing you that Germany thought it was really, really harsh. It is potentially biased because the source is its origins are from Germany, but it is useful for showing us what many German people thought at the time of the Treaty of Versailles. And you could link that into your own knowledge about the idea of a dictated peace, the fact that Germany didn't get a say in the treaty. Source C is also quite useful, pretty biased, I would say, because it's from an economist who resigned in protest against the Treaty of Versailles. So he may well have a motivation to make the treaty sound worse than it actually was, to justify why he'd resigned. So that might be something to consider as well. It is backed up a little bit by your own knowledge, because we know that Germany couldn't afford the reparations payments, although some countries like France wanted the treaty to be even harsher. So question 3 is write an account question. You would have 12 minutes to answer this question. So this question is write an account of how events in Manchuria became an international crisis in the years 1931 to 1933. Now, the Manchurian crisis was a key failure of the League of Nations, and it all started when Japan, which was a key member of the League of Nations, invaded Manchuria, which is the northeastern part of China. And China was quite weak at that time, and Japan was looking to expand its empire within the Far East. Now, really, for this question, you need to have really good own knowledge, and you really need to understand a chronology of when things happened. So a good way to think about this question is to think about it in terms of 3 paragraphs and think about a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I think one of the things you can do is think about, well, what did things lead to? Why were things significant? What was the impact of events? So on the next slide, I'm just going to show you an example answer, and you can pause it and read it in your own time. But you can see here clearly I've got a clear beginning, a clear middle, and a clear end. And I've just put in bold some of these linking phrases: as a result, this led to, as a consequence, as a result. So you're showing how one event led to another. And that's the key thing within this question, but also to have specific own knowledge as well. Now, some of you in your answers maybe only wrote 5 or 6 lines, your knowledge wasn't very detailed, you didn't have specific details, you didn't have specific names or events or dates, for example. That's what we mean by detailed own knowledge. Now, if I'm being honest, this example answer is probably a little bit long. You don't really need to write this much to get 8 marks, but this just shows you some of the things that you could have done. But do try and think about it in terms of the beginning and middle and end. So how did the Manchurian crisis begin? What happened when Japan invaded Manchuria? What were the consequences? The Lytton Commission, for example, and how it kind of ended with Japan leaving the League of Nations and the damage that did to the League of Nations as well. So pause it if you want to read it in a bit more detail. And finally, question 4, there were some really good answers for this response, some particularly good conclusions as well. One of the weak points here is that the other factors that you had perhaps weren't as extensive and detailed enough, so some of you missed some of those other factors. So we're just going to run through it, but basically for this question, you need 3 paragraphs. Your first paragraph, shown by this bullet point, evidence the Nazi-Soviet Pact was the key factor. So what is the evidence? What's the argument you can make? The Nazi-Soviet Pact, which was signed in August 1939, what's the evidence that that was the key factor? Then you've got to look at other factors. So you can write about a range of factors here, and it's important that you do. Particularly write about Hitler's actions, appeasement, but you could also write about weakness of the League of Nations, fact the Treaty of Versailles was too harsh. You could also write about the fact America was isolated as well. And then what's your overall opinion? So you probably, in the other factors, you may even have a couple of paragraphs within that if you wanted to. So you have a paragraph on Hitler's actions, paragraph on appeasement. It's worth 16 marks, this question, 4 marks for SPAG. Which means you would spend about 24 minutes, 25 minutes on this question in the exam. So you've got a quite decent chunk of time to actually write this answer. So these were the different points to construct an argument. Some evidence here for the Nazi-Soviet Pact. The key thing with the Nazi-Soviet Pact is that Hitler was worried about there being a war on 2 fronts. And he thought that if he invaded Poland, the Soviet Union might declare war on him, and Britain and France might at the same time, and then Germany would be fighting a war on 2 fronts, and that is one of the things that meant that Germany lost the First World War. So the reason for signing the pact was so that when he invaded Poland, he didn't need to worry about Russia attacking him, and this is absolutely key, or Soviet Union as it's called. The other factors you can write about, talk about Hitler's actions, appeasement, American isolationism, the failure of the League of Nations, the Treaty of Versailles as well. So there are some of the different ways you can construct an argument. I've just got an example conclusion here for you to have a look at. It's really important in your conclusion that you have an actual opinion, that you really give that opinion and back it up with evidence. So here will be an example one. So thanks for listening. I hope that's been useful. Bye-bye.